Greetings, everyone. My name is Angela Evans, and I have the honor of serving as Dean of the Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs here in Austin, Texas, at the University of Texas. This year, the LBJ School turns 50 years old. And throughout this landmark year, what we're trying to do is to make sure that this half century of the success of the LBJ School moves forward. And we've chosen the theme of In the Arena simply because it connotes the idea that people take risks, they go and they try hard to do some good work, and sometimes they fail and sometimes they succeed, but they always stay in the arena. They have a passion for their work and a purpose for their professional career. And with me today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Mei Mei Hu, who is the CEO of United Neuroscience and also a member of the Executive Committee of United Biomedical Incorporated. Mei Mei holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania and a JD degree from Harvard Law. And we'll get to why you think somebody with a law degree has gotten into and calls herself a vaccinologist. Mei Mei was selected as one of Time's 100 Next list. This is the emerging new talent that's filling the globe. So that was a great honor. And she was also honored as being one of Fortune's 40 under 40 innovators. And what I really wanted to talk to Mei Mei about particular, because when you hear her talk and you hear about her work, she talks about the democratization of health. And she started this with brain health, but this is her idea, is how do you bring health and how do you afford health, good health care to the masses. It's a very beautiful theme. And she's been a pioneer in a new class of medicine called antibody vaccine. So we'll get into a little bit of that before we end this. But I'm very excited about this because this is the first time we're actually talking to someone who's actually been in the arena on the vaccine stage. And consistently, ever since COVID has gotten our attention and changed many of our lives and brought in a lot of uncertainty, the two things we hear all the time is testing and vaccine, and that is the way that we're really going to overcome the impact of this virus. So I'm very anxious. Thank you so much, Mei Mei, for joining us today. And I just wanted to start with a couple observations. One is this virus is hitting a lot of folks. So the estimates that 1/2 of the United States population will contract this virus, and this is right now, so this may change as the virus continues to grow. And they're also saying that about 10 or 15% of those that have been infected by the virus will actually require hospital care, and about 5% of those will be in ICU. So the work you're doing has global impact. When we talk about pandemic, if we're talking about anything about public health and what you can do for public health, it's this. So what I'd like everyone to hear about is, first of all, a little bit about you and why you got into this. And I think people first start hearing about you and your husband when COVID was really starting to get the attention of the population in February of this year, where you decided, and your company decided, to go to Telluride and to test all of the residents in Telluride for the COVID-19 virus. And then you met in with obstacles, which everybody who does take risk and do good work has some obstacles, and some things don't quite work out the way you want. But can you talk to our listeners a little bit about your world and what brings you to this world and what drives you in this world?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Angela. It's awesome to be here. So I have a good Texan friend of ours actually that says the pioneers take the most arrows, and it's definitely true, particularly here. Uncertainty is pretty much the name of the game now. It's the only thing that we can count on. So our path to COVID-19 is like anyone else. It's completely non-linear. So I'm a lawyer by training, completely unqualified to be running a biotech company under any other scenario. In fact, if you asked me 15 years ago whether I would be in biotech, it would be a definitive no, although I grew up in the industry. So my mother is a scientist. She's actually a very prolific inventor and inventor of vaccines, in fact, the ones that we use. And so I think it was driven by impact and seeing the impact that you can have by democratizing medicine which is what brought me into the field in the first place over a decade ago. In terms of, maybe I'll just give you a little history of the company and how we ended up in COVID and now what we're doing. So the company, United Biomedical, has been around for over 30 years. We cut our teeth on making diagnostics, on antibody diagnostics, in fact. And we started with HIV and HCV and developed the first peptide-based diagnostic. There are other diagnostics available at the time, but we were the first ones to do it via peptide. And as a result, we cut basically the price of one by a fraction. And so all of a sudden, entire countries could basically use these to actually screen their blood supply. And then our next platform was vaccines. And we developed and commercialized the first ever peptide-based synthetic peptide vaccine, first in foot and mouth disease for swine. And so we now basically have scaled up to about half a billion doses a year. Wow. And we've sold over 4.5 billion in total worldwide. And the next foray was then into human health. So a large part of our company is actually based in Taiwan and China. So when SARS happened in the early 2000s, we were on the front lines. And we actually worked with the NIH to develop an antibody test and a vaccine. And fortunately, at that time, SARS was contained and it never, came to this situation. So when COVID-19 kind of sprung up, we were again on the front lines because we were in Taiwan and China. Our facilities closed early. We were looking and observing, and we decided, we were waiting on the sidelines and saying, should we step in? Should we not? Is this going to be another SARS? Is it going to be worse? And we decided, you know what? It doesn't matter which way it goes. If we can help right now, we're going to stand up and deploy. So we stood up our antibody test and deployed, almost 100,000 into ground zero in Hubei and Shanghai, Beijing, and Taiwan. And when it began coming to the US, my family, actually, we have a place in Telluride, Colorado, and, we'd seen it. So China and Taiwan have protocols because they've been through it before, and testing was a key to their protocol. And, at that time in the US, it was still kind of evolving. We were still trying to figure out how, what extent is this going to affect our lives? And testing was definitely something that was, still being sorted out. It still is being sorted out, but even then it was even more preliminary. So we decided, listen, let's give it a shot. We know how other communities do it. They test and clean communities. So let's give it a shot. And we wanted to serve our own community, who we could see was kind of painfully going through this process of trying to figure out what to do. And we decided to basically set a model and try to do a pilot test where we tested the entire county. And so that's where we started. I think to this day, we're still probably the first county that has offered voluntary testing for its residents. We had about 75% participation rate. And so, we closed down and in partnership with the county, basically tested everyone. And there was about almost 6,000 people coming through. And, we were able to do a very thorough prevalence study of how far COVID-19 had made it to our community. And I think that was the beginning of our antibody testing. And, in corollary, we can get into this, but testing has a number of functions and role in where we are with COVID-19. And one of them is obviously just to give information to public health officials on a more timely and accurate basis, but it also serves as a bridge to vaccine, which is also our core technology and core platform. So we're kind of going at both bookends of the virus right now.
That's what I thought was interesting too about your work, because it was the first time I've heard, you hear about testing and most of it, you hear about prevention, or actually trying to trace and to make sure that you can contain the virus. But there's this whole other aspect of testing, which gives you scientists information on how the virus really works, and then how that can feed into vaccine production. So I thought that was, I don't know if a lot of people really think about it that way. And that's what I'd like you to talk a little bit more about. Also, what you saw is a crossover, like if you're at ground zero and you saw how the virus was seeping into the population, but also how the government officials and the public health officials were dealing with it. And then you cross over to the US. What were some of the impressions you had when you first got into the US environment? What were some of the things you were seeing that you thought like, well, this is going to probably be a problem?
Yeah, so I'll take them backwards. So, in terms of the way different communities deal with it, it's obviously very varied. And it makes sense because you wouldn't expect every community to address COVID the same way. In China and Taiwan, it's a very top-down mentality, right? It is basically, contain, and it's very centrally led. China has, was very quick in terms of closing its borders, even between cities, and basically doing, mass quarantines and mass testing early on, and building hospitals. In fact, the hospitals weren't actually to treat people, but they were to contain people in quarantine so that they wouldn't continue spreading. And Taiwan has a very interesting position because their vice president is actually an epidemiologist. So he's a scientist as well as a politician, and they're probably one of the leaders in terms of the reaction to COVID-19. They don't have as stringent a crackdown, but what they did was, they were very prepared, and they have all these protocols in place from the SARS days. And so if you go there right now, everything's back up and running. The schools are open, people are back at work. Our facilities are up 100% capacity. And really they put in, lots of little things together that, it may just be temperature monitoring, but also meeting logs, sanitizers, and combined with testing to kind of contribute. And they're kind of lucky because they're on an island, so they can control the in and out much more easily. So when you come to the US, it's a very different landscape. We have states' powers versus federal powers. We have different types of communities. We have urban communities like in New York, but we also have very rural ones. And it's not easy to expect them to respond the same way, because oftentimes the same solution won't work for the same community. So when you see it coming, the question is, who's going to take a leadership role? Is it going to be the federal? Is it going to be led centrally, like in China, or is it going to be led more, state by state, kind of like the blocks in Europe? The only difference with us in Europe is, they have more control of their borders as opposed to in the US, where we have free transit across our state borders. So, when we saw it coming over, everything is just observe, and you have to make game time decisions based on the data that you have at that moment. One of the reasons why we decided to stand up the Telluride testing, or the testing in San Miguel County, was to say, here's one model. It may not work for everyone, but here's one model, especially if you're a small isolated community where you can close off, you can test, and you can potentially create some sort of safe sanctuary, and actually be much more reasonable and practically be able to trace community spread. So these are all considerations come about, and it's really, at the end of the day, where does the leadership come from? I think here, we shouldn't be waiting for a national policy, because it's probably not going to come, and every community has to figure out what's best for them, and that will change. But I think and that's why you can see different models coming about. In terms of where testing, what its role is, it's, I really see it as threefold. The first is just mass testing. Okay, if you look at the communities that have contained the best, they test, and that gives them good information. And that's from a public health standpoint. So we're talking testing regularly. What we're seeing is with communities and companies, particularly with essential workers, that it's a regular testing, almost as frequent as, every month. So serologic and PCR testing every month on, for all the employees, particularly the critical ones. But what testing also does is it gives you information about how the virus is working and how our body is responding to it. So with antibody testing particularly, there are two things. One is it can help in actually figuring out which antibodies are useful to neutralizing the virus. So this doesn't require mass testing, but this is done on a more specific basis when you see people who have recovered from COVID-19. It's interesting to take a look at their antibodies and say, they're not all the same. Some people have very high responses. Some people have responses to different epitopes on the virus. And when you combine this information, it can tell you which types of antibodies are actually more effective at neutralizing the virus. And that has mass implications for how to develop a vaccine and also a treatment. Another part of testing that maybe most people don't get exposed to is when you're doing actual clinical trials for testing, you want to make sure that you select the right population. So what we do is we actually test and screen ahead of time to make sure that the people that we enroll are what we call COVID naive. So you don't want them to have antibodies, because if they do, then they're not a very good control group for if you're vaccinating them. You don't know if it's your vaccine that's working or the fact that they've already developed naturally occurring antibodies. So I think testing also has a big part in clinical trials. I know that for other trials, and we mean for Parkinson's, for cancer trials, they're also doing a lot of testing to screen patients and make sure that they're either COVID naive or that they're not infected, because that's it's a huge consideration now. It's literally infiltrated every single part of our lives and drug development, even on non-COVID-19 programs.
Mei Mei, one of the things that you've been talking about, this is so complex and it requires so much sharing of information. When you think about the number of people that are involved in developing a vaccine and also developing the test so the test can be administered. So I have two questions. This has always been in my mind. When we talk about tests and people say it'll be safe if you can test the population that's going back into a workforce, whether it be essential or whatever. But given the fact, if you don't test every day, if you test once a month, you still can have someone who has the virus, who just hasn't demonstrated, the various characteristics of the virus. And I'm not sure how testing once a month versus testing every day. So that's one thing in my mind, because we're thinking about that with the university level too. You've got people coming on campus, and what is a reasonable, number one, population to test? And number two, how often do you test? So let's just go with that question first, and then I can talk to you about the complexity of the whole enterprise.
Yeah. It's a great question. I think at the end of the day, everything's a balance. There's what optimally there would be, right? And then there's what's practically possible. So, ideally you'd have a test that could be super easy to use. Maybe like you spit in a cup and within a couple minutes, they can tell you, whether you've had it, whether you have it, and what level, response you have. But unfortunately that level is not available right now. So then we go to, well, what's practical and what can actually be rolled out right now? And this will evolve. So what we do is, testing on a monthly basis is already quite frequent. And so I think there are folks that are thinking, particularly if you, so there's two things. One is just how much testing capacity is there in the United States? And there's a bottleneck.
That has been you even heard at the hearing yesterday, I think it was a bipartisan, it was a congressional hearing. Testing came up in every single, senator and member's mind. So it's really a big issue for sure.
Yeah, it's huge. And it's not just it's capacity and also accuracy, right? So from a capacity standpoint, we have bottlenecks on processing and also the supply chain. So when you have, when you have to essentially ration tests in some ways, it just means you have to prioritize. So when you prioritize, you think about, okay, what's the order? And so you think, okay, you have your essential workers first, the first line responders, people who are exposed to it all the time, right? Who are going to be exposed to higher risk situations. And so those will probably be tested more frequently. And ideally you would test every day, but it's impractical. And so we use surrogates. So we use surrogate markers like symptoms and, temperature. And the reason you test on a regular basis is you see, particularly if there are some asymptomatic carriers that are getting through your surrogate markers. a large percentage, a much larger than we initially anticipated percentage, are asymptomatic. And those are the carriers that could spread it without you ever knowing it. So when you have regular testing, you can, track them down and then contact trace to see who they otherwise might have exposed as well. So you have, but then you go back to your triaging, and you have, first responders, and then essential workers, folks of the gig economy that are essentially helping us continue to survive, particularly with, delivering food, supplies, everything. And then you get to outbreak communities, and then, to communities more generally speaking. And so you run down those priorities as your capacity grows, and it is growing, right? More manufacturers are coming online. The supply chain is shifting towards providing the reagents and supplies necessary to, target testing and vaccine development. And also the infrastructure is coming on. This infrastructure is massive. I mean, we're at the end of the day a widget maker, right? We make tests and get them out. And what we're finding is it's the infrastructure, because most of the people that need testing are not generally in the business.
Right.
Right. So, you have a company. A company normally doesn't have mobile phlebotomists on call that are going to be, able to draw employees' blood, and then they don't have labs to process. So, even though we provide the tests, we have to then figure out how to put everything together. Mm-hmm. And that has been one of the infrastructure challenges. And that's why partnerships and building an ecosystem is so important.
So Mei Mei, your beautiful little daughter, she's adorable. Next generation, right? Yeah. Mei Mei, when you think about this is the other thing when you're thinking about trying to coordinate this across the nation. So the complexity of, number one, the testing, the number of tests and the different approaches that the tests are made, and the different suppliers of the tests, the different brands, and then how you get that test out and disseminated to people who need to have it, and then how those results are weighed. All of just that alone, when you think about the enormity of the players in this, if you're sitting in a state of Texas or a city of Austin, and you're thinking about how do we decide this, from the demand center, we have a demand of it, and then we've got the supply, and getting those together is, I'm really amazed at how this could all happen. And being in public management, or being in a school where we're trying to talk to students about how you work these very complex collaborations, it's interesting to me is how do you, as a producer, as somebody who does a test, somebody who's making a vaccine, how do you start collaboration with folks who are actually going to use it? I mean, and what difficulties are you finding in getting to the right place with the right product?
Yeah, no, so there are challenges that we never thought we would ever have to face, being in our position. And I'm sure that holds true for folks in almost every other industry. There's a lot of noise out there right now. And anytime you have uncertainty, there's going to be a lot of noise. And some people, people will deal with that differently. So, one of our biggest challenges is, there are many, but cutting through the noise of antibody tests. There are 200 producers out there. And are they all great? Probably not. Some of them are highly inaccurate, or,
Well, who's monitoring that? I mean, you all in the science community, you all know peers, and you always have, peer review in science. So how do public officials understand that? Like if everyone's competing and you say who's good, better, best, and I'm just trying to put myself in a policymaker's position here and trying to determine this.
It's a challenge, and so the FDA generally takes that role, right. But they're understandably swamped. I mean, it's not usual that you have 200 applications for the same type of product overnight. Right. Not to mention that they are already swamped with everything else they have, and so they actually issued unprecedented guidance back in March that allowed an accelerated process of basically notification and self-validation of getting a lot of these tests on there. They're now trying to and starting to ring that back to filter through the noise, right? So this is basically a pulsating, very dynamic situation where we're going to have to try stuff and then we're going to have to pull back. We're going to try stuff and we're going to have to pull back. But unless we try stuff, we're not going to move forward. Right. So I get where they're coming from. From the end user's standpoint, it creates a lot of noise. So how do you filter through it? There are tests with an EUA out there. The irony is that there are now tests with an EUA that wouldn't qualify under the new guidelines that was just filed this month. So, but they're trying to work through that as well. We just signed a deal with the National Quarantine Center and the Global Center for Health Security earlier this week. And so, there's some word of mouth, right, of folks that are doing their own validation to make sure that you're the test of choice. And so in some ways, getting references on well-validated tests is important. But otherwise, I empathize with the situation that others are in. We're a test maker, and now all of a sudden we have to be a full solution provider. So a state may say, I want testing, but they don't have that infrastructure. And so you have to basically pencil it together. You have to knit it together and help provide a solution, and even plan, to help people try and get it out there. So these are things that, we're standing up, and thankfully we have good partners. So what we've been focusing more on is finding the people who have already done that and weaving in, and those people will actually probably repurpose their network. So, we're working with someone who has a network to, hundreds of universities, and it's not being used for what it is now. Instead, it's being used to deploy testing.
So this is all being done sort of not informally, and I don't want to make that sound like it's just happen chance, but it's being done by individuals by their own initiative, trying to form these collaborations and networks where you're sharing information when you're through the whole, through the whole pipeline, and then getting really good data out there, because, what we focus on so much is making policy decisions based on data, making policy decisions based on cutting edge innovation. And here, we're actually, I think the complexity of this is we're actually trying to experiment at the same time we're trying to use that data to make policy. And then, policy is not as agile as the creation of data. You create the data and then the policy has to follow. So this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges we're facing in the country with regard to creating an atmosphere safe enough to get back to somewhat of a productive society through it, through the testing modalities.
Yeah, I mean, it also, to put some perspective on it, we're really only a couple months in, right? It feels like a lifetime in many respects, but this is pretty recent. It's less than a half a year for the entire world. And the amount of data we've already collected is tremendous. But, it reminds me, sometimes we're deluged with data, but very little useful information. And so now our trick is, how do we, weave it together and make it unbelievably useful to make actual decisions. And there are efforts, and I see public and private efforts. I wish that there would be, there are consortiums pulling together every state, and most communities have their own task force on this. And I'm not privy to how much communication within, like inter task force there are. But I know that the data is out there, and there are groups trying to do independent evaluations, but it would just be great if there was some sort of centralized repository where people can work together. I'm often reminded of, a lot of times we don't have to look that far, just back in history to see how we've handled it before. So if you look at polio, for instance, it was similarly, detrimental. During the summers back then, we would close down train stations, public movie theaters, pools. And for a long time, there were a lot of disparate movements. There were, the researcher here, there, and it wasn't until the National Foundation was created, which was a privately funded group that then centralized, hey, these are the three things we're going to look for. These are the three research areas that we need. And from there, within a few years, we had a polio vaccine. It was coordination of these elements coming together, hopefully it doesn't take us 20 years. We're only 5 months into it. So I think, things work lightning speed in comparison, but it's going to ultimately take some sort of collaborative effort.
I was part of that initial Salk, experiment. It was one of those kids that went to public school and got the shot.
Wow.
So one of the things that we've been thinking about is the way the public responded to public officials' invitations or messages to go and be involved versus today, where we've got so much going on with social. It's not just the public officials. Everyone has an opinion. So everyone's got a blog or everyone's got social media. So in addition to what you're saying and trying to get into a group that has the trust level and also the way to talk about it that shows, it shows it very accurately, is confounded a lot because of, these things that 1 minute it's this and next minute it's that, and it's not coming from authoritative sourcing, it's coming from people's opinions. So that has another layer of complexity in terms of those of you who are trying to keep moving forward based on really good data, really good information, and the public officials who are trying to, how you find them and match with them.
Yeah. So I have to, good information is always hard to come by. And I think one of the things that we have to understand now is it's okay to change our mind based on new information. Because there's, if you asked me 6 weeks ago, I would have had a much more definitive stance on where testing should be than I do today. Mm-hmm. And really, it's the more you know, the less you know, and the more open you are to new solutions. So right now, one of the things that feels like is it's a race to an end. And I think, it may be, it's just a different way of thinking, but, if we opened it up to say, maybe it's not a race, maybe this is a time for humanity to open up and show what makes us human, which is collaborating, that we'd actually get there faster. So it's not going to be a one vaccine at the end of the day. I think those are one of the questions, but, it's almost impossible for it to just be one. I mean, what else do we have one of? If you look at statins, we have many. If you look at cancer therapies, we have many. Even, Tylenol, Advil, we have many different things. They work for different people. They work under different circumstances. Not to mention just the supply challenge of using one platform to supply the world. Vaccines are 6 billion people in the world are vaccinated. So there's an infrastructure for it. But to think that one product will be, the only one is maybe a distortion of where we think we're going to be. So I think if we get to the place where it's not going to be one and it's going to be building an ecosystem, there may be more collaboration or free sharing to get us there faster. But I think overall there's a lot of information. Again, it's just filtering through the noise, which is in many ways the hardest part right now.
Yeah, and it's also for, our just a citizen who's not in public policy or a citizen who's not in the in the science community. You can watch the news and you can see pictures of labs and people doing things, but really understanding how complex this is and how much this is really, I think this is we're in a massive world experiment. We talked about this, it's like this whole world is in this pandemic and we have to think, will we listen to data? Jury's out. Will government structure support, public health? In some places it is, in some places maybe not so. Will we collaborate across, even in the United States, across, jurisdictions, let alone globally? Are we starting to say, well, you're my enemy, you're my friend, so, I'm going to listen to you or I'm not going to listen to you. Even, some of the United States having more regional consortium where states are coming together to do something. And will private-public partnerships really show us that this is a way to go and when we're dealing with really, really complex problems. And then, well, what you're saying and what I really loved about our conversation before we got on is this for the public good? Are we doing this for the public good? Or are we doing this as a public good being secondary, but the first thing is making money on this? Like who's going to beat out who on this? So I think we're in a really, it's an extremely interesting place, but it's a place that has a lot of mobility. It can go in a lot of different directions. Some could be bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think it's the most complicated situation. I mean, it's unprecedented, and as such, we're facing unprecedented problems. I will say that personally, we've found a very collaborative nature on on a private to private level with other companies, even so-called competitors. It's
Good.
been unbelievably refreshing. So, we have a vaccine program, actually several vaccine programs, and we are collaborating with other folks with vaccine programs to share and compare notes. That is not very common in,
Yes.
other situations. Like, we will send them material to test and vice versa. And so there is a next level, just because people are curious and they realize that they can't answer all the questions. But it's definitely complicated, but that's an understatement.
Yeah, yeah, I know it's simple-minded that, oh, it's complicated. Well, Mamie, I don't want to, take up this whole hour just with my questions. So I want to take some questions. And one of the things that we're trying to do with the Zoom is to do it so people can participate in the actual event. And so I have a question here, and this is from a public official. If we want to plan well for the future, can we keep test components on hand to be better prepared to test more widely for the next novel virus that comes along? For example, can the reagent be kept on hand at a state level? In other words, is this something that the deterioration of the test may be such that you can't keep surpluses? Are you all thinking about that type of thing when you're developing the test?
So when you say, so there's two clarifications. One is a novel coronavirus. Generally speaking, the test will be very specific to this COVID-19. And you want that specificity because you don't want to get, false results by picking up others. There is a general shelf life on tests, and it varies from test to test. I do know that there are folks that are stockpiling. So, it depends on which time horizon you're looking at. Will there be a second wave? Almost certainly. And so will these tests be useful within that period? Most certainly. So, the idea of essentially, anticipating increased testing demand is something that is good foresight. In terms of stockpiling, I actually think that if you look at the ramp up of testing, that we'll get there. And actually, everyone is ramping up, so hopefully we don't need to stockpile these tests. So I actually probably didn't answer the question at all, but
I think you make a good point. I think you're making a good point, because some of these questions, and my questions too, come from the very beginning experience we had with the virus. We don't have enough of this, we don't have enough of that, we don't have enough, we don't have enough tests. So if you don't have enough of something and then you get it, and it's sort of a logical question then should we be ready in the case the next thing comes along? Meanwhile, in that process from, the time we get this in our heads to the time we are now, there's been a lot of development and a lot of knowledge that's been gained that can change that original question.
One thing I'd say is having a preparation plan, particularly a pilot program. I think one of the reasons why Taiwan and China did so well early on was because they'd gone through this experience before and developed protocols, so they knew how to do it. Sometimes it's not just about having the actual reagents in stock, it's also about deployment. So having that experience already will go a long ways when the second wave comes back and you're required to do that. It may not be immediate deployment, but having the system in place and being able to stand up quickly is going to be critical to shutting and containing very quickly, any future outbreaks.
Mei Mei, have you or any of your collaborators worked with universities who want to open to talk to them about how best to open through a testing protocol? Or
so we're actually working with the university. The University of Nebraska is the home to the National Quarantine Center and the Global Center for Health Security. So they advise, the White House, the Pentagon, the DoD, others as well. And they're one of the first ones to anticipate opening in full. Absolutely. I mean, I know California schools announced that they were going to stay online, but I know others want to open. And so we have been talking, and this is where the serial testing comes in, right?
Yeah.
There's a priority of testing of who to test and how often. And, you know, one of the things is you do a baseline test of all students that come in, and then you do a regular screening of certain employees that are going to be more exposed on a regular basis. And you basically keep an eye on with surrogates for mostly the student population meantime. So, you know, you treat symptoms, fever checks, like physical distancing, you put all those precautions in place. But then folks that are exposed to many, many people, you know, whether it's your, you know, service workers, folks in the medical center, in that case, you do, you know, more frequent testing. But there are programs, and it's not one size fits all. So it's not you test everyone all the time, because that's just onerous. So you basically divide folks into risk categories, and there may even be a different cadence for a PCR test versus a serology test. But there's definitely guidance evolving, and you know, we may try one thing, and it may evolve, depend on, you know, if an outbreak happens, then you're going to switch your testing strategy.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things to come out here is there's no definitive answer, and it's going to be a lot of testing, not just the actual test, but just testing and adapting.
Yeah. Being agile.
But you got to, you put a stake in the ground first, and you do it, and then you may have to modify, but you start.
You have to start somewhere, otherwise you're
just.
I have a really interesting question here on my chat. What's one assumption you initially had that you've done 180 on?
Interesting. I wouldn't say it's 180, but I actually thought the prevalence of COVID-19 was going to be much higher than we initially found. So even though in Telluride, based on the numbers that we found as being confirmed via PCR versus actually having been exposed, we're an order of magnitude off. We actually thought it was going to be even higher. So it's under 1%, at least as of a few weeks ago, and we were anticipating at least 5 to 10% at that time. So why does that matter? Because we're farther from herd immunity than we ever anticipate. So the idea of using antibody testing and tracking herd immunity, it's a longer ways off than we would have hoped.
So this is going to be with us a while, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, there are some communities in northern Italy where they're looking, and they anticipate it's going to be more like 60, 70%. But at least in the US, we don't have evidence of that. And maybe it was a little hopeful that we would be closer, but when we're in the 5, 10% range, it's a longer road ahead for that. So.
Mei Mei, I have another question, and I think this is an interesting one. When you were talking about having multiple vaccines, I think some people thought like, whoa, wait a minute, we have, one vaccine for, the question is, don't we have one vaccine for polio and one vaccine for diphtheria? And so how are we going to do multiple for, for the COVID? Can you just elaborate a little bit more for the listener on that?
Yeah, so is the question as at the end game, there may be multiple vaccines on the market?
Yes.
So we actually have multiple vaccines for polio. So if you look at, Salk's vaccine, it actually had Salk and Sabin both had vaccines. So they're different forms. And they have different benefits and hold on a second. Hey, Ryan, honey. Thank you. Yes, sorry. Yeah, we can go on a treasure hunt after this, I promise.
We're going on one now. We're on one
Yeah.
now.
Different vaccines will work for different people. And there will be pluses and minuses of different vaccines. That's just the way it is. And so we actually have different vaccines right now for, we have different flu vaccines, MMR, there's different companies that are making them. So it's kind of like Coke and Pepsi in some ways. It's probably a terrible analogy, but we will have different ones and we may cycle through it. It's not clear what the deployment will be, right? It could just be that one vaccine makes it to market first. And, it may not be the most effective one, but it's the one that's out there first. And so a lot of people get it. And then the second gen comes out, or the next vaccine comes out, and we find that it's more effective. So there's going to be a cadence or a staggering of when vaccines come online. There may be that some vaccines work for certain people or may have different safety profiles. It may just be that there's not enough supply of one vaccine for everyone. You just look at the way antibody testing and PCR testing is right now. So long as it's effective and it's approved, we're going to find a way to deploy on it. I use Advil and Tylenol. Why do we choose one versus the other? So I think it's similar to vaccines, even though I know that in our minds, it's like usually we go to the doctor and get our kids vaccinated, and we really don't have choice on brands, right? This is not a branding thing. And you may go to the doctor and, how many, if anyone's gotten a test, you go to the doctor, do you know which test you got? Most likely not. So that's how it's going to be deployed. It's going to be probably behind the scenes deployment and sharing of multiple vaccines.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is where it's helping the public understand the complexity of actually not just creating it and testing it. And then, of course, the virus can just say, well, you're doing that, but I'm going to mutate. So lots of luck, here we go. Because that's the other thing they're saying, at least initially, that this particular virus seems to be, and maybe it's not, that's just hearsay that I'm hearing, that the mutation level of this is very quick too. So as soon as you get one, you may have to, modify for another.
Yeah, there's definitely mutations happening. It doesn't seem as quickly mutating. It's doing very well right now. So viruses usually only mutate when they're hitting a wall, and so it's quite, it's doing a good job as a virus is concerned. So it hasn't mutated seriously, but that is always a concern. And if that's the case, then it may become like the flu, where we have to figure out and predict the strain in advance and manufacture against that. And I know that there are going to be efforts simultaneously to do what we call like a pan COVID vaccine, where, where you try to have a single vaccine that can neutralize or prevent multiple different types. That's going to be a little farther off just because, you need more data. It's a longer term strategy, but I definitely wouldn't be surprised if we're going to be basically redesigning for different minor mutations over the years.
Mm-hmm. I have you'll enjoy this comment, and this is about, I love that child moment. Scientists are real people after all. So I love that. That comes from one of my fellow deans, who's one of my favorite deans, and he's just a great guy. So he's a scientist too. So he put that in the chat.
Yeah. Well, one, I'm not a scientist. I only know enough to be dangerous. And two, I think one of the beautiful things, this is just a comment for what it's worth, but in this time, in some ways we're physically distant, but in other ways we're actually more intimate. So now you're on Zoom and you see into people's homes, and it's rare that there's not a dog or a child in the background. So
it's true. It's very true. I'm going to read another one. This says, especially with the recent FDA pullback of unvetted antibody tests, what do you think is the best way to ensure the serological testing information and related guidance out there is reputable and accurate? Like recent focus on the self-validated tests from the, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it, the Hangzhou biotech company?
Great question, and don't have a perfect answer. You can generally see validation data on the test, so I'd always ask for the validation data and see how it was done. The FDA requirement is only like 30 samples, but most have many more. And with an antibody test, what you really want to see is the specificity. That's the most important part, because that's where the danger comes in. With the PCR test, which is detecting whether you have actual virus at the moment, you worry about false negatives. So you worry about putting someone back on the street that's actually infectious, that is claimed negative. And with an antibody test, you worry about the opposite, which is telling someone they have antibodies when they actually don't.
They don't.
So you look at the validation data, and it should be, per FDA guidance, be in the instruction for use insert. So it's the directions. At the end, they should have a little table that tells you what the specificity and the sensitivity is, and you should look at the specificity and see, make sure that they've tested against other coronaviruses, other viral infections, and then see what the number is. And you want to get as close to 100% as possible. 95% really, to us, isn't cutting it, especially with a 5% prevalence rate. You're talking about over 2/3 of the people that you say will have antibodies probably don't. So,
wow.
It seems like a very, 95% accuracy, it seems very high,
Yeah.
but when you actually run the statistics and think about the low prevalence rate that we have, you can be basically giving, 2/3 of the people the wrong answer.
Wow. Mei Mei, is that because when you look at antibodies, do you think that is because some people's symptoms are very, they're not very severe? I mean, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know. So somebody who's been in a hospital has such a bad case and built an antibody, is that a different kind of antibody that somebody who is at home has it, got sick, didn't have to go to the hospital, had a couple miserable days, and then that's done? Is there a difference?
Yeah, okay, so there's two questions embedded in that. One, everyone has a different antibody profile, just like you may react to the flu differently than I do. Our immune systems have different types of responses. So generally speaking, if you're hospitalized for COVID-19, you're going to have higher antibodies because, you've been overwhelmed and your body is fighting harder.
Right.
So you'll see higher levels of antibodies. Maybe if you're younger, you'll actually have higher levels of antibodies, just because your immune system's, potentially stronger, but there's actually not that much correlation, but there's just variation at this time. Also, some of your antibodies will be against different parts of the virus. There are different epitopes that are kind of exposed, and your body will see them differently. And some will have a lot of, antibodies against S protein, which is the neutralizing part that we want. Others will have against other parts of the virus. So yes, definitely different people have different levels. And one of the things that we want to develop is actually not just a positive negative antibody, but also say, how much antibody do you have?
Yeah.
The second part of the question, why do we have false positives, is because a lot of these tests, they get confused with if you have antibodies to another coronavirus.
Mom, what is this? What is this?
I'm not sure, but we got just a few more minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
What is this?
I think it's for your glasses.
But you don't have glasses.
And so it will be essentially, it may confuse it for another thing that you thought was a cold. And so it will confuse the antibody profile for COVID-19 versus another coronavirus.
Okay. Well, I just, I can't tell you, Mei Mei, how really wonderful it was to spend time with you for several reasons. You're doing such an incredibly important thing. You're contributing to something that's really going to change the era in which we live in a lot of different ways. But also the way you explain things and your approach to, I really like this approach to, let's all work on this together. Let's collaborate. Let's democratize, the ability to provide good health and health screening. Thank you so much, Mei Mei, for all you're doing. I wish you the best in everything that you do, and I hope we'll see in some period of time, we can't say when, that people feel comfortable being back together again, and maybe we can see each other in person.
That would be wonderful. I look forward to the day where we can sit together and be together and not have COVID-19 hanging over us.
Yeah,
So.
I think we all feel that way. And your daughter's adorable, so tell her hello. And so I want to thank everybody else for joining us on this and being with us today. And I want to remind everybody that this video session will be up on the LBJ a website on Friday. In addition to this, the one thing that's different about the LBJ program is that in addition to this recording, there will be a series of articles and journals and materials that for each session we put together for you to do a deeper dive into some of these questions. And next week this will be on May the 20th, we have a collision of a refugee and health crisis. This is going to be really important since we have the largest migration of the human species taking place now, and many of these people are in really extremist conditions. So we will be joined by Dr. Ruth Wassam, who is at the LBJ School and an expert on immigration. And she'll be joined by Eric Schwartz, president of the Refugees International, where they're really going to discuss this unprecedented global migration and the impact that COVID may have on them. And of course, the vaccine would be wonderful. So thank you again. And thank you again, Mei Mei, and thanks to everybody who joined us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think